Kings, queens, and castles. Not the medieval ages, but chess. Chess is a game of strategy. It's simple to learn, and it has an interesting history. In fact, Abekba's History of Chess says that chess is roughly 1,500 years old, and it was started in northern India, they believe. Back then it was called Chaturanga, and it was primarily used to train the noble elites of the Indian society on how to conduct warfare. From then, chess moved up towards the Persian Empire, where it stayed roughly stagnant in that area for a few thousand years. By the 7th century AD, the Arab Caliphate had invaded and rediscovered chess, sending it along the Silk Road east and west. Each place it stopped, it changed its variation in its name, and in China they called it Go, in Japan they called it Shogi. By the 9th century AD, it finally reached Europe via Spain because of the Moors' occupation of Spain. So at this time we start to see the modern variation that we're used to. And by the 15th century is where we actually start seeing the pieces morph into what we are more familiar with, based on the medieval society at the time. That's why we see the castle or rook, knight, bishop, queen, king, and pawns. Interestingly, O'Sullivan's Chess in the Middle Ages, the queen was modeled after Isabella, the Queen of Spain, the most powerful woman in Europe at that time. So, as we see, we have the board itself. It's an 8x8 board, 64 squares that alternate between dark and light in color. This is what it looks like when you start the game. You have the pawns on the second rank, and then you have the pieces, like I just said, on the first rank. You have 6 pieces in all, 16 pieces in total per person. The game begins with the light-colored piece player, and they alternate moves. You have one move per turn, and then it's the other person's turn. Each piece has its own moves and laws that govern its moves. Starting with the most complex piece, we have the pawn. The pawn can only move one square at a time forward in direction. It can never move backwards, except the movements are with the exception with its first move. From the second rank, where it begins the game, it can move 2 squares if it chooses to. Another thing about the pawn is that it captures opponent's pieces different than its movements. So in this position, it captures diagonally with 1 square to its left and to its right. The next piece that I'll move into is the knight. The knight is the only piece that can actually jump over any other piece on the board, yours and your opponent's. It has a movement more of a shape of an L. So what you want to do is actually count 2 squares. In this case, you'll count 1, 2, and whatever square is on the left or the right is the square it can move to. So in this case, we can move it here, and now you have more options, because it's a piece that once you move it, the more it's in the center of the board, the more options it has. So again, if you want to do this and look at it yourself, you count 1, 2, and it can move to this square or this square. The same thing horizontally, you count 1, 2, this square, this square. The same thing applies to the bottom and the other side. A quick way to remember what colored square it can move to is if you look at the color of the square that it's currently occupying, it will move to the opposite color square in the next move. This is also the way it captures. If there's an enemy on this square, it would capture it that way. The next piece to go into would actually be the bishop. Now the bishop is interesting because it moves diagonally on the board, and it moves on the starting color square that it begins the game with. So this would be the dark square bishop. It only moves on the dark squares. As well, this is the light square bishop. It only moves on light squares. It can move back and forward on this diagonal. Of course, if you move it here, you get more options, and you can move it back and forth. So the next one I want to move into is actually the rook or castle. This one is very simple as well. It moves horizontally and vertically and horizontally across the board without any limitations on the amount of squares it can move in one turn. The only limitations it has is it can't jump over a piece, and if there's an enemy piece, it can capture it. The next one is the queen. This is the most powerful piece because it can move in any variation similar to the rook and to the bishop, meaning that it can move on any square, vertically, diagonally, horizontally, forwards, and backwards. If it wants, but it can only do that movement per turn. So if I make a turn with this, it's going to be this way, and that's the end of my turn. The next and the most important piece that we have is the king. The king can move one square at a time in any direction. Its one limitation is that it cannot move into a square where it would become captured. For example, if you have an enemy piece here, for example, the king cannot move into this square because that would put it in check, is what we call it. So it can move to this square, or it can move to this square, but not to this one because it would be in check. The next thing that is important to the king is that if the king is in check, if your opponent puts your king in check, he has to do one of three options. Either he moves out of it to another square that's not being threatened, he gets taken by one of your pieces or the king himself, or he can be blocked by one of your pieces. If the king cannot be moved out of check in one of these three options, it's checkmate, the game is over. Again, to emphasize, we see the board as a setup as this. When you start the game, just like this. Now, is there any benefits to playing chess? There is. Actually, the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health in 2019 says there's evidence that chess could prevent dementia from occurring in people that regularly play chess. What about educational benefits? There is. John Artis, his book on chess and education, he states chess is definitely an exercise in memory, and that memory can be transferred over to other subjects. Children that play chess regularly tend to have better memory. Now, I've talked about the history of chess. I've showed you the basic rules and how to play the chess. And I've talked about its benefits. Me personally, I love playing chess. I play it every day. I think it's fascinating, its history, and I love playing a game that is so old. I'll end with a quote by Benjamin Franklin. He said, "For life is a kind of chess, in which we often have points to gain and competitors to contend with." Thank you.